Some engines fail because they're inadequate. Others disappear because they're too good. The Ford 351 Cleveland falls squarely in the second category, an engine so effective that racing officials across multiple series rewrote their rulebook specifically to neutralize it. The Cleveland wasn't banned in the legal sense. Nobody wrote regulations explicitly prohibiting it. Instead, officials restructured weight penalties, reclassified displacement categories, and created multipliers that effectively eliminated the Cleveland's competitive advantages. Why did an ordinary production engine force every major racing organization to rewrite their rules? The answer lies in cylinder heads that shouldn't have existed on a street engine, engineering borrowed from race programs and mass-produced for showroom cars, and Ford's brief moment of building something so good that emissions regulations and corporate accountants conspired to kill it. 4 years of production created 50 years of legend. The Cleveland proved you could over-engineer yourself right out of business. Historical context and development. Ford's existing 351 Windsor served reliably but conservatively. The small ports and restrictive cylinder heads limited breathing, creating adequate power for economy applications but leaving performance enthusiasts wanting more. Competition from Chevrolet's 350 and Mopar's 340 and 360 engines demonstrated that better head design could extract significantly more power from similar displacement. By the late 1960s, as muscle car wars intensified, Ford needed a performance version of the 351 that could compete on breathing capability rather than just displacement. The solution emerged from Ford's new Cleveland, Ohio engine plant between 1969 and 1970. The engineering team included veterans from the 427 program who understood that cylinder head design determined an engine's performance ceiling more than any other single factor. Their philosophy was straightforward. Take the best elements of Ford's 335 series architecture and add race-bred cylinder heads that would transform the package from adequate to exceptional. The 351 Cleveland shared displacement and bore stroke dimensions with the Windsor. Both were 4.00-inch bore and 3.50-inch stroke. But the similarities ended there. Cleveland's bore spacing measured 4.380 inches compared to Windsor's tighter spacing, creating room for massive valves and ports that Windsor's architecture physically couldn't accommodate. This wasn't minor refinement, it was fundamental redesign around a singular goal: maximum airflow. Ford offered two versions to serve different markets. The 2V two-barrel configuration targeted economy and mild performance applications. The 4V four-barrel version was serious business, a racing foundation disguised as production equipment. Those 4V cylinder heads became the key to everything the Cleveland achieved, the component that made an ordinary displacement extraordinary. The Golden Age. Between 1971 and 1972, the Cleveland reached its performance peak before emissions regulations began strangling output. The 351 C4V and the Mustang Boss 351 carried conservative factory ratings of 330 horsepower, but dynamometer testing commonly measured 370 to 390 actual horses. Ford's typical underrating to help buyers avoid insurance penalties. Torino GT models equipped with 351 C4V engines ran mid-13 second-quarter miles, performance that matched or exceeded big blocks from competitors. The De Tomaso Pantera, Ford's Italian-American supercar, relied on Cleveland power to achieve exotic car performance. Australian Ford took the Cleveland to its ultimate expression. The Falcon GT-HO Phase 3, equipped with a specially prepared 351 Cleveland making over 300 horsepower, became the world's fastest four-door production sedan in 1971, achieving 140-plus miles per hour top speeds. This wasn't racing modification. This was showroom equipment that happened to embarrass purpose-built performance cars. Racing domination followed predictably. Bud Moore's Boss 351 Mustangs won Trans Am races against purpose-built competition. In NASCAR, the 351 Cleveland competed successfully against 426 Hemis and 427 Big Blocks, despite giving away 75 cubic inches. NHRA stock eliminator classes saw Cleveland's dominating their categories. SCCA production racing featured Cleveland-powered Fords winning consistently. Australian Touring Car Championship witnessed GTHO Falcons taking Bathurst victories. Everywhere the Cleveland raced, it won or finished on podiums, regardless of series or rules package. The problem for racing officials became increasingly obvious. A 351 cubic inch engine was competing successfully against 400 to 440 cubic inch power plants. The Cleveland wasn't illegal or modified beyond rules. It was simply impossibly good within existing regulations. Those cylinder heads flowed air like race motors while meeting all production requirements. Rules had been written assuming displacement determined power potential. The Cleveland shattered that assumption, proving that intelligent design could overcome cubic inch disadvantages. Street reputation solidified around iconic applications. The Boss 351 Mustang became an instant classic, recognized even in 1971 as special. The Pantera proved that Ford's small engine could power legitimate exotics, embarrassing big block muscle cars with its combination of power and handling. Modification potential seemed endless as enthusiasts discovered the Cleveland responded to even basic improvements with dramatic power increases. The aftermarket exploded with Cleveland-specific parts, recognizing the platform's potential before Ford itself seemed to fully appreciate what they'd created. Technical brilliance. The cylinder heads told the entire Cleveland story. Those 4 V-heads featured port volumes measuring 210 cubic centimeters on the intake side, dimensions associated with big block engines, not 351 cubic inch small blocks. The canted valve angle of 14.5 degrees improved airflow characteristics by allowing straighter paths from port entry to combustion chamber. Valve placement created direct shot airflow that minimized turbulence and restriction. Short turn radius design, the critical transition from port floor to valve seat, was minimized through careful development, eliminating a common restriction point. Compared to the 351 Windsor, the Cleveland flowed 60% more air. Against Chevrolet's 350, the advantage exceeded 40%. Stock 4V heads flowed over 260 CFM on the intake side, numbers that big block engines struggled to match without extensive porting work. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was a different category of breathing capability disguised as production equipment. The block design provided foundation for the head's potential. Thick main webs created strength that Windsor's lighter architecture couldn't match. 4-bolt main caps were standard on 4V versions, with 2-bolt mains on economy 2V models. The large bore spacing created room for serious overboring. Cleveland blocks could safely reach 4.030-inch bores and beyond without creating thin cylinder walls that threatened reliability. Taller deck height allowed longer connecting rods, improving rod ratios and reducing side loading on pistons. Deep skirt construction added rigidity that helped the engine survive racing stresses. Windsor's smaller chambers and conventional design actually worked better in the low-compression malaise era. The Cleveland was optimized for conditions that ceased to exist. Brilliant engineering rendered obsolete by regulatory reality. Challenges rise. Racing organizations responded to Cleveland dominance with targeted rule changes between 1972 and 1974. NASCAR adjusted minimum weight requirements per cubic inch, specifically structured to hurt the Cleveland's power-to-weight advantage. NHRA reclassified Cleveland's in stock eliminator, moving them into higher classes where they competed against significantly larger displacement. SCCA Trans Am rules introduced displacement multipliers for over-square engines. Transparent attempts to neutralize designs like the Cleveland that generated power through breathing rather than cubic inches. Australian officials took the most dramatic action. The GTHO Phase 4, an even more powerful Cleveland variant planned for 1972, was banned before it raced. Officials claimed it was too fast for public roads, but the real concern was competitive imbalance. Ford had created something that made existing racing formulas obsolete, and rather than celebrate engineering excellence, sanctioning bodies chose to eliminate the problem through regulatory changes. Emissions regulations delivered the knockout blow that racing rule changes couldn't completely achieve. In 1972, compression ratios began dropping as lead phase-out and catalytic converter compatibility became mandatory. By 1973, Cleveland power had fallen off a cliff. The 351 C4V that made 330 horsepower in 1971 was rated at 266 horses in 1973. The 1974 models dropped further, falling under 250 horsepower. The open chamber heads that enabled brilliant high compression performance became anchors in the low compression era. Cost considerations sealed the Cleveland's fate. The engine was significantly more expensive to manufacture than the Windsor. Canted valve heads required complex casting and specialized machining equipment. The Cleveland plant operated below capacity while the Windsor facility ran continuously. Corporate accountants asked the obvious question: why build an expensive Cleveland when the cheap Windsor provided adequate power for Malaise-era requirements? The answer satisfied spreadsheets, if not enthusiasts. The transition. The year 1974 marked the Cleveland's death in American production. Power had deteriorated to 235 horsepower for the 4V version. Adequate, but no longer exceptional. The Boss 351 had already been canceled after a single year in 1971. Pantera production would eventually switch to 351 Windsor power. The Mustang II that arrived for 1974 was tiny, its engine bay physically incapable of accommodating the Cleveland's dimensions. Ford had no mainstream applications remaining that justified Cleveland production costs. The XB Falcon GT became a Cleveland-powered legend between 1973 and 1976, producing over 300 horsepower when American Clevelands were strangled to 250. While America forgot the Cleveland, Australia refined it, developed it, and proved what the engine could have been if regulations and economics hadn't intervened. The engines that replaced the Cleveland in American production were compromises and cost savings measures. The 351 Windsor returned as the default 351, cheaper and adequate for Malaise-era requirements. The 400M and 351M variants, based on 400/460 big block architecture, arrived with their own compromises. Neither matched the Cleveland's potential. Both were uninspiring solutions to problems that didn't require uninspiring answers. Legacy and modern reality. Today, the collector market assigns premium value to Cleveland components and vehicles. Bare 4 V-cylinder heads command $1,500 to $3,000 per pair. Expensive for used castings, but reflecting their capability and scarcity. Complete 4 V engines sell for $3,000 to $6,000 depending on condition. Australian Cleveland variants bring $4,000 to $8,000, valued for their later production and higher compression specifications. Boss 351 Mustangs trade between $80,000 and $150,000 plus at auction. Panteras equipped with original Cleveland engines command premiums over later Windsor-powered examples. Australian XB Falcon GTs sell for $100,000 to $200,000 Australian dollars, their Cleveland power central to their collectability. The what-if question haunts Cleveland enthusiasts. If emissions regulations had arrived 5 years later, if racing officials hadn't restructured rules, if Ford had invested in developing closed-chamber heads that worked at lower compression, The Cleveland could have dominated through the 1970s and 1980s. Ford built an engine so good that racing officials had to stop it, then emissions killed what regulations couldn't. 4 years of production, 50 years of legend. The 351 Cleveland proved that sometimes being the best means being the first to go. Subscribe for more engines that were too good to last.